2 police officers shot while on duty, plus 3 separate drive-by shootings on freeways in 1 week. We take a look at what may be driving these trends. Plus, a jarring new look at how widespread the fentanyl crisis is in our area. We're breaking down which local county just reported a rate of nearly 2 overdose deaths per day, and the people who are the hardest hit. And a local shelter already struggling to survive is being pushed to the brink by Seattle's ongoing mental health crisis.
The Spotlight brought to you by Beacon Plumbing.
Good evening and welcome to the Spotlight. I'm David Rose. So far this year, there have been at least 18 drive-by shootings on freeways in King and Pierce County. Just this week, Western Washington has been flooded with gun violence. A teenage girl shot in the leg in Tacoma, and a woman shot in the head in Seattle's First Hill neighborhood. And then there are the 2 officers who were shot in the line of duty. King County Sheriff's Detective David Easterly is still recovering. He was shot twice while serving an eviction notice on Monday in Ballard. And just 2 days later, Everett police officer Chad House shot in the head while responding to a robbery call.
It's concerning to me that we have, the level of violence that we're seeing in our community, whether it involves police officers or whether it involves our community members. I think we have, too many guns in the hands of people that shouldn't have guns.
So we know the problem, but it's going to take the entire community to solve it. Because it's a complicated issue, the best way to begin to tackle it is with the data. 2 years ago, the governor and the legislature created the Office of Firearm Safety and Violence Prevention. Their mission is to reduce all firearm violence. I met this week with the executive director, Kate Kelly, to ask what it will take to do that.
When you hear about the recent gun violence involving 2 police officers, in addition to the other violent crimes we've already had involving homicide victims in our state, Pierce County, King County, Snohomish County, since the beginning of the year, does it make you feel like the work that you're doing is more urgent right now?
There is a great urgency to the work, regardless of individual events that are occurring throughout the year. All of those events are regretful. Some of them we hear about it in the news, some of them we don't. For example, every time there's a mass shooting, particularly shootings at schools, we hear about that in the news, and it raises people's awareness of firearm violence. But in fact, it's a public health emergency that's occurring every day in our state. We know that safe storage of firearms can help prevent injury and self-harm. And so our office is very much involved in promoting mechanisms that can help keep people away from firearms when they are a threat to themselves or others, and also to help put firearms in a safe space within homes so that they can't be accessed by people who shouldn't access them, including children. One of the concerning things we found with the Healthy Youth Survey, and that's a survey that's conducted among students in our state, was how many of them have access to firearms. A high percentage know where to go to get access to a firearm.
Let's say in the next 12 months, where do you think the most urgent focus needs to be?
We've been thinking about it a lot, and we're just initiating a major project that's going to help improve the implementation of protection laws in our state.
Is there any data that shows that somebody has reached out for help about ahead of time? Or is this do you know what I mean? Or people just being so quiet about it until it becomes they didn't ask to get the guns out of the house?
And there's usually signs, but whether or not those are communicated to the appropriate people or they even know where to communicate them. So often we hear after the fact that, he was amassing weapons or he was threatening me. Somebody should have noticed that there was a pattern there.
Right.
But so that's part of our education and outreach. With the protection orders is a slice of that, but just making sure that people know this resource is there. And if we can even save one life, if we can even help one family deal with the trauma they're suffering.
Most of the attention on police reform this legislative session has been focused on efforts to loosen the rules for some police pursuits. But another bill may have a much bigger impact on law enforcement in our state, and it's moving fast towards final passage. House Bill 1579 would set up an independent office to investigate deadly police shootings, and one case in particular was brought up repeatedly at the final public hearing, the March 2020 death of Manny Ellis.
Tacoma, as you all know, Manny Ellis's name was just shared. For me, and why I continue to show up at these hearings to testify is because it's incredibly important.
Appearing before the Senate Justice Committee, Tacoma Mayor Victoria Woodards told members she still feels the local investigation of police conduct in the case was botched, creating a crisis of confidence that undermines the good work police and prosecutors do every day.
There are communities who don't and who've been impacted and can't see a path forward in trying to see more transparency in our local prosecutors. So while that may not necessarily be true, it is a lot of people's perceptions. And I think that we need to begin to do things that change the way people perceive the justice system.
The state legislature has already created a new Office of Independent Investigation to review deadly use of force incidents, but it lacks the authority to file criminal charges. Bill sponsor Monica Gerardo-Stonier says now is the time for lawmakers to finish the job.
When we were revisiting policies that had been part of a reform package post kind of the George Floyd and racial equity awakening in the country, we were looking a lot at policies in the state, and this is one piece that was left undone from that package.
Stonier tells the Spotlight that her bill isn't anti-cop, it's pro-accountability.
It's important to consider how crucial it is to have this independent office independent of any political influence, just as important as not having it overly influenced by local relationships. So by design, the office will have that insulation.
In many ways, House Bill 1579 would use the Ellis case as the blueprint for handling all fatal police shootings in the future. 1579 takes the investigation out of the hands of local prosecutors in favor of an independent team within the Attorney General's office. It was AG Bob Ferguson who finally decided to charge 3 Tacoma police officers in Ellis's death. In the 40 years prior to the Ellis case, there had only been 3 officers ever prosecuted for fatal use of force statewide. But opponents of this bill say that 99% clearance rate doesn't mean the current system is broken.
There are instances where an officer was prosecuted for murder, charged with rape, charged with obstruction, even arrested by their own deputies.
Taylor Gardner, a policy director with the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, challenged committee members to see the small number of use of force prosecutions in a different light.
The perception that law enforcement officers are not regularly prosecuted is not proof that the system is corrupt. Rather, the fact that Washington's law enforcement officers are rarely prosecuted for wrongdoing should be an indication that officers are complying with the law.
Following that hearing, the Senate Justice Committee delivered a due pass recommendation. Next up is a full Senate hearing and vote, which could then send it to the governor's desk. 1579 already passed in the House, 52-44. Coming up, we're breaking down which local county just reported a rate of almost 2 fentanyl overdose deaths per day, and how one key to stopping these tragedies may lie in the hands of your primary care physician and not law enforcement. Even as Border Patrol agents make record-breaking seizures of fentanyl, there has been a surge in overdose deaths this year, as the synthetic opioid pills known on the streets as blues continue to have a strong grip on communities locally. Alarming new data shows how it's driving overdose deaths in King County. So far this year, the Public Health Seattle and King County dashboard shows 198 people have died from a fentanyl overdose. That's up significantly from 2022, when there were 113 fentanyl overdose deaths in King County during the same time period. As fentanyl fatalities surge, local governments are putting more emphasis on harm reduction strategies. Some efforts, like legalizing fentanyl test strips, are not without debate, but David Dickinson, the regional director for the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, says the goal is to keep drug users alive so they can have a chance to recover when they're ready.
I have sat with families who've lost a loved one.
David Dickinson is a behavioral health expert who firmly believes that harm reduction is the right strategy to beat the fentanyl crisis. These fake opioid pills are flooding into our state, more powerful, dangerous, and addictive than ever, all to lure in those already vulnerable to abusing them.
When you've lost your job, you've been disconnected from your family, you've lost family members, all of those can contribute to sort of unbearable emotional pain. And so people turn to substances, sometimes legal substances like alcohol, or sometimes illicit substances like heroin or fentanyl to relieve that pain.
That means meeting drug users on their turf to stop overdoses without judgment.
But what we do know is if you're dead, you can't make a choice not to use. When we talk about the opioid epidemic, means taking the necessary steps to make available to people opportunities to reduce the likelihood of death. That's a harm reduction. A life saved means a life with another chance, another opportunity.
SAMHSA recently gave Washington $27.5 million for state opioid response funding to support and expand treatment services, plus block grant funding for another $39 million, money that could be spent on fentanyl test strips. Right now, those are considered illegal drug paraphernalia in Washington state. However, a bill is making its way through the legislature that would legalize them.
If you have fentanyl strips available in the community, let's say someone goes to a needle exchange site, but they could also acquire fentanyl test strips. If they're actively using and they test the substance before they use it, there's a chance that they don't use that particular substance. So right there, you may have saved one life.
Dickinson says another step in the right direction is a recent change by Congress that allows drug users to get opioid use disorder medication like buprenorphine directly from their primary care provider.
And if you have a trusted relationship with your primary care doctor, then you have this opportunity to have an open conversation. So we hope that that'll make a big difference because we'll have more prescribers available to prescribe buprenorphine and to alleviate people suffering from the disease.
Still, he estimates there are more than 9 million people abusing opioids in the U.S. Even though only about 1 in 10 of those will actually seek treatment, there still are not enough beds and services available. So last fall, the Biden-Harris administration awarded $1.6 billion in funds for communities to start to address the overdose crisis.
I have to be hopeful that we'll turn a corner on this, and that rather than focusing on the deaths that have occurred, as sad and sorrowful as those are, that we will begin to focus on the lives that have been saved.
Dickinson says Washington State has an impressive model that tracks the number and locations of treatment beds available in your area. If you or a loved one is struggling with addiction and you're looking to find treatment, you can call the SAMHSA National Hotline. The number is 1-800-662-HELP, or go to www.findtreatment.gov. Well, they say a few bad apples can spoil the bunch. Turns out the same is true for community safety. Up next, how focusing on Seattle's own bad apples is paying off. Seattle businesses have known since a system failure report came out 3 years ago that it was the same group of prolific offenders causing most of the crimes they face every day. Now, Seattle City Attorney Ann Davison tells the Spotlight's Zach Anders that an initiative she started a year ago is showing promise at keeping those same suspects from committing more crimes.
And so right now, the consistent approach is you have to have some time that you are not in the community doing this.
Last year, Seattle's new city attorney decided to go another way, relying less on diversion programs, once touted as a success by her predecessor, instead implementing a so-called high utilizer initiative, targeting some of the city's most prolific offenders, assigning special focus to identify them, then get them what they needed. In all, 168 people were identified as these high utilizers, individuals with the most rampant records in the city, some with dozens of thefts, assaults, and harassments. Like John Lomack. You may remember footage of his brazen TV take from Target last year. Court documents alleged Lomack had stolen from that Target 22 times. He was added to the high utilizer list. Today, he's in jail.
Why is this person being left in this repeat criminal activity for years, and no one has paused long enough to figure out why? We need to be changing our response, and that's what we did here.
The High Utilizer Initiative changed how their next encounter with the law was handled. For one, under current booking restrictions at the King County Jail, only domestic violence and DUI offenders could be held. But for high utilizers, a deal was struck between the city and the county. Regardless of the type of misdemeanor, a high utilizer could be held at the discretion of law enforcement. The city attorney's office claims the move was in part a deterrent to those individuals and resulted in 750 fewer misdemeanor referrals made by police.
So then what do you think is really making the difference for some of these people?
Sadly and frankly, some of it is in custody time, because the amount of impact that they have had on neighborhoods, as I mentioned, some are multiple times a day in the same location, multiple thefts, multiple harassments of employees, multiple assaults on employees.
Before the initiative, the 168 averaged over 6 misdemeanor referrals to the city attorney's office a year. During this initiative, that was cut in half.
It was really significant. And again, trying to recenter victims in the public safety conversation, that was the piece to me that was missing, because when you don't look at 40, 50, 60 referrals from one individual, you have overlooked a lot of victims on the way.
142 of the 168 served jail time last year. Many of them battle addiction, and while the city says it still tried to steer them towards treatment options like before, most either failed or rejected them.
Coming up, an emergency shelter in West Seattle, pleading with the city to provide more mental health resources to the homeless population. Moving on to another big concern for Washingtonians, the mental health crisis and the lack of resources for those who need it, whether it's voluntary or court-appointed. A Seattle man accused of multiple crimes, including murder, has now collected tens of thousands of dollars of taxpayer money while he's behind bars. This is a case you may remember from the news. Alexander J., accused of several violent attacks in Seattle. He was accused of attacking a woman, a nurse, at a light rail station, kicking her and throwing her down the stairs. When he was arrested, there was no room at the mental health facility, forcing him to stay in jail. A judge ruled he was owed $250 in taxpayer money for every day he wasn't sent to a mental health facility. We did the math. It appears he racked up $78,000 before finally being admitted to Western State Hospital earlier this month. While extreme, Jay's case shows what happens when legal requirements and good intentions outpace our official capacity to provide, and the importance of some unofficial assistance when there seems to be no more room to help.
They sent him down here in an ambulance. He had been shot in the leg and in the foot in a drive-by shooting incident. They took the bullets out, cleaned his wounds, stitched him up, wrapped his leg in bandages, and sent him to me.
Keith Hughes is used to opening his door to help people in need, but sometimes those people need more help than he can provide.
I'm not a doctor. I don't even have a Red Cross certificate.
As the president and only full-time staff member of the West Side Neighbors Network Shelter in West Seattle, Keith spends his nights overseeing one of the only shelters in King County that will accept anyone in need of a place to sleep at any time, something many hospitals and law enforcement departments are very aware of.
I don't lock down at a certain time. So, they know that if they find somebody in a bus stop freezing, they can bring them here. If it's 1 o'clock in the morning, I'm going to answer the door. I'm going to answer my phone.
Most shelters lock their doors around 10 p.m., but no matter what time of night, there are always people in need of a safe place to go. Some of them discharged from local hospitals when they're deemed stable enough to leave or not in serious enough condition to stay.
I've had people sent here directly from Highline Hospital, from Swedish Hospital, from Harborview Hospital, from Virginia Mason Hospital.
From ambulances to police cars, even Ubers, people arrive at the West Side Neighbors Network with one thing in common: they have nowhere else to go.
And I've had Novus Mental Hospital discharge people out the front door, and the only piece of personal property they had with them was a piece of paper with my name and address on it. and they come here. And I'm supposed to take care of those people?
Keith isn't going to change his open door policy, but he's frustrated that his shelter is the late night drop off point for people that need a lot more than something to eat and a warm place to sleep.
At 10 o'clock at night, an SPD community service officer brings this guy down here directly from Swedish Hospital. The guy was a paranoid schizophrenic.
And after 3 days,
I've got to get this guy out of here. He's a danger to himself. He's a danger to the other people in my building. He's disruptive. I can't keep him here anymore. He shouldn't have ever been brought here in the first place.
When the police arrived, they told the man to gather his things. Then they walked him out to the sidewalk and left him there.
And it was, by the way, 35 degrees that morning. So a 62-year-old man with serious mental health issues and not a lot of clothes on his back was at 35 degrees outside, escorted to the sidewalk and told, which way do you want to go, that way or that way?
Keith himself has been trying to decide a new direction for the shelter, maybe even going to a year-round operation. But while giving out help comes easy to Keith, asking for help to find grant money or other public assistance can be hard for him.
I didn't grow up in a family environment situation where you asked people for stuff. You took care of yourself and you did it yourself. And it's difficult for me. So can I do that year round? I don't know. If I had help, if I could get a staff and have people to work, 3 shifts of regular time, I would absolutely have this would be a full-time year-round shelter. But I just can't do it by myself.
Well, that's all the time we have on this edition of The Spotlight. Until next time, be smart and stay safe.